Caterina Petrolo, the prosecutor who became an advocate for Indigenous recognition in Canada. There's a particular kind of anger that builds slowly. It doesn't explode. It organizes. For Cathy Petrolo, that process began not in a courtroom or a policy briefing, but in the quiet accumulation of government letters, denied applications, and years watching someone she loved be told, repeatedly, that his identity required more paperwork. Caterina Petrolo is a woman shaped by two worlds: the precision-driven arena of financial operations and compliance, and a deeply personal fight for Indigenous rights that began in her own home. The way those two worlds collided, and what she built from the collision, says everything about who she is. Why Caterina Petrolo stopped following the rules and started rewriting them. In 2009, Petrolo decided to step in. She believed, as she describes it, that her persistence could cut through the noise. She was wrong, at first. She followed the government's lead, submitted what they asked, and hit the same dead ends her partner had been hitting for nearly 2 decades. The process was not broken by accident. It was broken by design. October 2020 marked a turning point. Petrolo re-engaged with the file, but this time with a different posture. She made clear she would not accept the unit's past behaviors or comply with requests she considered frivolous and unethical. She demanded the file be reviewed in full before any new documentation was requested. The new members of the adoption unit agreed to that undertaking. A comprehensive summary was provided to the council. And finally, after 29 years, her partner received his certificate of status. What drove her approach was not emotion alone. Her background in financial operations had trained her to document everything, track every communication, and build an airtight case from evidence rather than appeals to fairness. In her own words, precision and documentation were the tools that moved the needle where advocacy on its own had stalled. The bureaucratic patterns that Cathy Petrolo refuses to normalize. Growing up in Toronto, Petrolo was never taught about Indigenous cultures in school. Not once did the curriculum acknowledge the histories, the communities, or the ongoing realities of the people whose land the country was built on. That absence, she now recognizes, wasn't an oversight. It was a pattern. The same pattern showed up in the federal adoption unit's behavior. It showed up in the reservations she visited with her partner over the years. It showed up in the infrastructure failures and the housing conditions and the lack of clean water. Petrolo's position is direct. Most of those failures trace back to the Canadian government. Not as a historical footnote, but as an active, ongoing policy reality. Clean water on reserves remains a documented, unresolved crisis across multiple communities. Indigenous children adopted outside their communities have faced systematic barriers to reclaiming legal identity. The Indian Northern Affairs adoption unit's processes were, in Petrolo's direct experience, built to exhaust rather than assist applicants. Educational curriculum in major Canadian cities like Toronto historically excluded Indigenous history entirely. She doesn't frame these as unfortunate oversights. She frames them as choices with consequences, and she's not interested in softening that framing. From operations to Indigenous studies, what Petrolo is building now. Petrolo recently enrolled in Indigenous studies through the University of Alberta. The program focuses on the histories, cultures, and contemporary issues of Indigenous peoples across Canada. For someone who came to this subject through lived experience rather than academic instruction, the coursework has deepened something she already knew intuitively. Indigenous communities are not a monolith. The diversity in language, worldview, and community priorities is, as she puts it, breathtaking. The tendency in mainstream Canadian discourse to collapse that diversity into a single narrative is not just lazy. It's a barrier to any real allyship. Step 1, in her view, is understanding that a policy solution that works for one community may be entirely wrong for another. Her interest in social justice and Indigenous rights didn't start in a classroom. But the classroom is giving her a more rigorous framework for the advocacy she's already doing. That combination, lived experience plus structured knowledge, is exactly the kind of foundation that tends to produce durable change rather than momentary noise. The principles that run through everything she does. Ask Caterina Petrolo what guides her, and the answer comes quickly: accountability. Not as a slogan, but as a living standard. If she says she's going to do something, she shows up fully. No shortcuts. That applies to financial operations, and it applies to fighting a federal bureaucracy for nearly a decade on behalf of someone who had already been fighting it for 2 decades before she joined. She doesn't chase recognition. The measure she cares about is whether anything actually changed. A status certificate issued. A policy amended. A community with clean water. That's the return on investment she tracks. A few consistent themes run through her approach, whether the arena is professional or advocacy-driven. 1. Document everything, from the first contact to the final resolution. 2. Resistance must accompany persistence when the system itself is the obstacle. 3. Rest when necessary, but don't conflate fatigue with defeat. 4. Growth shows up as discomfort, not as ease. She also knows when to step back. Emotional fatigue is real in work that constantly surfaces injustice. Her approach is boundary setting without opting out. Rest, then return with better strategies. It's a practical philosophy, not a poetic one, and that's exactly why it works. Where Cathy Petrolo is headed next. Petrolo is now exploring how to combine policy research with digital storytelling as a way to put Indigenous voices at the center of advocacy, rather than filtering them through intermediaries. The model she's interested in is decentralized. Those impacted lead, and allies contribute tools, funding, and strategic support. Not speaking for communities, but amplifying what communities are already saying. That framing reflects a maturity in how she understands her own role. She's not the hero of this story. The people who spent decades trying to reclaim their legal identity, who grew up on reserves without adequate infrastructure, who were educated in systems that erased them, those are the people the work is for. Caterina Petrolo's job, as she sees it, is to make herself useful in their fight without making herself the face of it. It took 29 years and one very persistent woman to get a piece of paper that should have arrived in 1992. Cathy Petrolo knows exactly what that gap costs. And she's not done yet.